Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Africa Economic Symposium, a conference organized by the Policy Center for the New South. This year's theme is the role of science, technology, and innovation in driving Africa's economic growth. The theme of today's conference is Macroeconomic Policy Challenges in Africa. We are honored to begin the conference with a series of opening remarks by Karim El-Ainaoui, Executive President of the Policy Center for the New South.
Okay, so marhaban, welcome, bienvenue, willkommen, bienvenido.
Willkommen, welcome, bienvenido, and I'll stop there.
And thank you for your support and commitment to this first edition, the first edition of this event that we want to make a regular encounter. And there's a good reason why we've started this series of what we want to be a regular conference is that there is an issue with the narrative about Africa. Without being too militant, but this is our conclusion after 10 years of practicing policymakers, journalists, academics, students, a broad array of stakeholders, that it remains an issue. Who tells the story of Africa? Who says Africa is happy, Africa is sad, Africa is rising, Africa is declining, Africa. And as economists, we're doing the same with our colleagues in international politics. But here, as economists, we want to tell a true story about Africa. First of all, and Dr. Arkabe yesterday addressed our students, and one of his words was the issue of Africa as a dummy, Africa as a unity. Africa is diverse, of course, 54 countries. There is a general narrative, of course, of the global economic outlook of Africa, of MENA, but it's not enough. It doesn't mean much concretely, and it creates an environment where the assessment is blurred for the general public. And for a general public, let's take investors in the financial community that don't have time to invest and understand Africa. Understanding something takes a commitment and investment in your time, in your, it's a trade-off. You decide to spend time to understand Africa, or you read the newspaper, one article, and Africa is rising, and then in your head, this year Africa is doing okay, the next is doing, and when you allocate investment as a, fund manager, then it plays out in the end, since it's repeated all the time. So really the purpose of this conference, that we want to be an expert conference. You are all great experts, specialists in your area. We want to tell a true story about Africa with the sufficient level of details and rigor as well. And it's important also for the younger researchers that are engaging in academia or in their careers working on Africa. We wanted this conference to be to have two legs, one looking at current outlook and one looking at structural issues, long-term issues such as the role of technology, which is becoming an important component of any. Il faut caler le micro à fait qu'il y a trop d'écho, c'est très difficile pour moi. Morceau l'écho. Je peux parler plus fort si vous voulez, mais j'ai du mal à m'entendre en retour à Monsef. Il faut baisser le retour. Voilà. The second point is we want also to make this the day where we launch our annual report. We have Larabi Jaidi, who is the one that has edits every year our report on African economies, and it's the 4th edition, and it will be presented at the end of conference. So we want, as we've done with the Peace and Security Conference, where we have a report on geopolitics of Africa, we want to have every year, and you can count on us to be committed to this conference every year, to have this report being launched. So if you're interested also to contribute to this report next year, the man in charge here at the Policy Center is Larabi Jaidi. So this is on why we're doing this and what we're trying to achieve, and it's consistent with the mission of the Policy Center for the New South, an African voice with, I would say, a light-minded spirit, a spirit where we are militant but engaged with our friend in the North, with tolerance, openness, and with the science and the rigorous analytics, fact-based empirical work drives public policy making and drives the debate. It is very important. The Policy Center for the New South is not an advocacy think tank. It's a science-based institution. The second part that I wanted to share with you is we are meeting in a context, and I'm hoping that all our speakers will give us, shed some light on this very complex context. It's a context where macroeconomic policies, macroeconomic management is more complex, more difficult. There are, of course, rising interest rates. There are shifts in the financial stability that are affecting portfolios. There's, of course, stubborn inflation. We tend to forget inflation, but there is still sticky and the residual inflation that is there in many countries, including here. There is, of course, we are today inheriting the debt of accumulated over the past year because of the shocks, COVID and various commodities, 2011 in this region. They are today you can read this in public debt, so there's an issue of debt management. There's also, and it is affecting all of us, of course, the more politics in economics, of course. This is the return of international politics. This is the return with the revenge, in a way, of geopolitics. And it affects policies, of course. Governments everywhere put a heavier weight on security and resilience in energy, in food, in anything that has a structural weight or is a structural component of their internal security. Look at Europe, of course, look at the US and look at the dynamics between China and the US in terms of proprietary technologies, but not only supply of energy, supply of food, etc. So that's, we cannot today as economists have a discussion on those issues without having this in the back of our minds. So that is a difficult context. Pressures on monetary, fiscal policy, with less margins of maneuver, less space, fiscal and debt, and of course, enormous structural challenges in terms of the role of the technology and the transformation in the labor market, etc., plus the geopolitical, international politic dimension of any choice you will make internally on what used to be, I would say, simple and straightforward choices, and not least, of course, policies, because of this security dimension, that are negatively affecting us. Enormous subsidies in many advanced economies, both in Europe and in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, or a slow progress on this continent of trade integration, trade, convergence of the facilities for trade, the FTA, the free trade agreement continent is making slow progress. Many countries are, of course, entering negotiation with the IMF for debt reduction and stabilization programs. Some are coming. So this is the context where we are getting together. So again, many thanks to all of you for traveling. It's great to have you here. We're spending the next day and a half together. Use this opportunity to discuss, exchange. The Policy Center for the New South is at your disposal. With the spirit I tried to describe. Colleagues and friends are here also if you want to share your ideas for next year. This is the first sort of, you're part of the pilot experience. This is the first edition of this conference. We run many conferences, so we know how to do that. The colleagues, my colleagues whom I thank for organizing all this, but still this is a first edition for this specific conference. So again, many thanks and see you around.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin our first plenary session about the challenges of monetary policy, navigating inflation dynamics in the face of supply shocks. Please welcome on stage the moderator of this session, Mehdi Bartal, professor at the Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Morocco. And now, please join me in welcoming on stage Ibrahim Al-Badawi, Managing Director at the Economic Research Forum, and Abla Abdellatif, Executive Director and Director of Research at the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies. Abebe Aemro Selassie, Director of the African Department at the International Monetary Fund in Ethiopia, will be joining us online. A short video of the session will be now displayed on screen.
With the confluence of the COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, African countries are bearing the brunt of a complex economic landscape, characterized by a sluggish economic recovery, tight international financing conditions, and persistent inflationary pressures present in 50% of African countries. Central banks in Africa are at the forefront, tasked with a delicate balance, fostering economic growth on the one hand, while curbing inflationary pressures on the other. In fact, in order to fulfill the price stability mandate, African central banks have tightened their monetary policy through unprecedented policy rate hikes that could have potential economic long-term effects. In these circumstances, monetary, fiscal, and financial authorities need to ensure the implementation of a coherent policy mix in order to address the current macroeconomic imbalances. How can African central banks effectively manage the trade-off between inflation and growth in the current environment? What are the potential long-term effects of the current wave of monetary policy tightening in Africa? How can African central banks adapt their monetary policy frameworks and tools to effectively address supply shocks? And what policy mix frameworks could be used to address macroeconomic imbalances in African countries?
Mehdi Bartal, the floor is yours.
Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the session dedicated to the monetary policies and inflation. As an add-on to the video, we'll never focus on that enough. The COVID and the Ukraine war have triggered a worrisome increase of the price, and inflation is on all the lips. This is the reality that is striking the world over. The 70s and the oil shock have taught us that inflation may be difficult to curb. and I am under the impression that the microphone is also difficult to control. Now, an increase of prices and rates today can, in some circumstances, lead to and fuel future price hikes, leading to an inflationary sprawl. In view of this threat, the central banks the world over have acted to increase their interest rates and prime rates in Morocco, for instance, between summer 2022 and last summer 2023, and in the aftermath of many successive increases. I'm sorry, I think I have to slow down because I can hear myself, says the speaker. If it's all right with you, I'll continue, says the speaker. Now, the rate has gone twofold, going from 1.5 to 3% in a lapse time of 1 year. And the next decision will occur in a couple of days from now, and it is highly expected today. Therefore, we're going to be back on this ongoing inflation topic with a focus on Africa. What are the sources of inflation and the offer shocks? This is not something that we understand systematically, immediately, offering shocks. How do these offering shocks propagate and percolate in our economy, and what challenges this raises in the face of the monetary policy? There will be other sessions on the budgetary and fiscal policy, for instance, but we'll be having also the possibility to talk about budget and fiscal policy also. To meet with these questions with us are three speakers of high caliber who, through their current path, know well Africa. I briefly and partially introduce them to you. Madam Abla Abdelatif, who is the Director of Research of the Economic Egyptian Center, Mr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi, Managing Director of the Economic Research Forum, and Mr. Abibi Amro Selassie, who has not been able to come with us in Rabat, but is online, who is the director of the African department at IMF. Welcome to all of you, the three of you. Now, before recognizing the floor to the first speaker, some general indication on how the session is going to take place. We will be having about 30 minutes first part, whereby each of the speakers will be having the opportunity to shed his own light on the current situation, following which we're going to be opening a session of Q&A with the public and myself. Let me now forcon to Madam Mrs. Abdelatif. Mrs. Abdelatif, tell us. There are two languages. We're going to be working in the French and English languages, so we're going to be agile. Mrs. Abdelatif does not need to have interpreter, no, but she understands French, but she will react in English. So what are we talking about when we are talking about offering shock or offer shock? How did they come to exist in Africa, and how is it, and why is it a challenge in Africa? Thank you. I do understand the French. I speak French, but not this time around. But from a for technical purposes, I will now shift directly to English.
Well, I want to extend my condolences to the Moroccan public on the death due to the earthquake last week. Since I'm here, I think it's important to do that. And I would like to thank, of course, the Policy Center for the New South for this important initiative, for inviting me to this first edition of the African Economic Symposium. I think it's a very important topic, and the raison d'etre of the center itself is key because nobody is talking enough about the South, particularly the New South. Okay, let me answer the important and complex question raised by the moderator in three parts. First, what are we talking about here? What kind of shocks are we talking about? Why is it considered to be a problem or a nightmare for the policymakers? And why is it particularly a problem in Africa? And this is going to touch upon how the central banks are actually working on it. When we talk about the shocks, historically, the shocks were demand shocks, okay, increase or decrease in demand. Except for the supply shock that happened during the 70s. But what we are facing recently are all supply shocks, okay? What is the nature of those supply shocks? We are talking about the increase in the prices, the shortages in food, and the increase in international prices because of that, particularly wheat. We are talking about the shortage in oil. And of course, we are talking about all the obstruction to the supply chain, particularly because of transportation issues following the COVID. The three elements are associated with the COVID, of course, and the post-COVID period. It's also associated with the Ukraine-Russia war, and of course, it is also associated with the climate. And the climate is a topic in its own right, in causing all sorts of problems. Now, this means these are all supply shocks, not only supply shocks that are affecting the consumers because they don't have enough access to the food that they need or the energy that is needed, but it's also a supply shock that's facing producers. They cannot meet all their needs in order to do any manufacturing because there is shortage of transportation. Now, those supply shocks are interesting and different from before, because even though we can give them titles like this, okay, when dealing with them, you find yourself falling in a whole taxonomy of things. Okay? Are we talking about temporary risks, transitionary ones, or we are talking about permanent one? Are we talking about a shock that is for a period only, or is it a permanent? Are we talking about shocks that lead to specific risks to companies or something, or are we talking about systemic risks? So it's not it's not only demand and supply, but it's rather a bunch of things, a whole taxonomy. It's like a whole new dictionary, and because of this whole new dictionary, it is quite complex, as we are going to explain now. Now, the second point, why is it a nightmare for policymakers? I start with the obvious. Okay, if it's such a complex taxonomy, it's not clear if it's permanent or temporary or affecting units or affecting the whole economy, then we are talking about something that's very difficult to deal with because you cannot see in advance its extent. So you are missing a lot of guessing in trying to deal with it. And so if you make mistakes in your policies, you are going to realize them later after you do the application and not beforehand. There is no time for doing studies, okay, of cost-benefit analysis and trying to understand what works and what doesn't work. And this is the first problem. But the second problem is even bigger. When we were talking about the past, the world went through a long period with low interest rates and low inflation. Okay? And so there was no problem in dealing in relation between monetary policy and fiscal policy. They were consistent with each other. Okay? You don't find any kind of disagreement between them. But right now, the situation is different because we are dealing with a global situation where there is inflation and there is a very high level of debt, public debt and private debt. What does this mean? It means that when you use this most famous tool of monetary policy, the interest rate, when you raise the interest rate, you are increasing the service of the debt. So you are immediately putting a burden on the government and on the fiscal policy. Okay? And there has to be some consistency of some kind between them, and this affects the independence of the central bank. So this is actually all hidden and all happening at the same time. One more level also of inconsistency that's happening is that interest rate is used all the time to beat inflation. Okay, it's like it's a religious tool. It is the main tool, almost the only tool. But then when you increase the interest rate and you know that inflation is demand driven, okay, then by increasing interest rate, we know the theory, people are going to save more money to benefit from the rate. They're going to consume less, so you can control it. But if the inflation is a cost push inflation, if it's because of the supply issues, okay, then what you are doing actually is decrease output also. So you are trying to beat inflation, okay, and you end up decreasing output and not beating inflation. And this also is a very serious issue and a very serious concern for policymakers. Now, why Africa? What is special about Africa? Let me start by saying that Africa is not heard, Africa is not seen in the world. This is a reality. Okay? Even when they talk about it in big meetings, that's always on the periphery, never at the core. The African continent, most countries are commodity-dependent markets. Okay? So all the changes that happen internationally affect them, they hit them very hard. Okay? That's number one. Number two, food represents a very big component of their basket of consumption. So when obviously there is a supply shock at the food level, they are very badly hit. When you look at the sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, okay, Most countries are net food importers. The same applies to oil. They're also net importers of oil, so it's the same problem. The deterioration of the climate is causing a challenge of its own, because it can cause domestic supply shocks as well. Because of the deteriorating climate condition, agriculture is in a very poor state, and because agriculture is in a very poor state, then even producing food at home is a problem. Not only the imported food, but also producing food at home. Okay. Countries, as Dr. Karim was saying and very nicely explained the framework, countries are highly indebted, and so you are simply adding, with the supply shocks, are adding an extra burden on their plate. Okay? Add to it the fact that with the climate deterioration, they are asked to adopt a green transition policy, which is going to actually impede Africa's ability to develop. Okay? And they are doing this even though they are not responsible for the climate damage. Africa, the whole continent, contributes no more than 3% of the damage in the climate. The rest is coming from the developed countries. Okay? And this actually takes us to something, a key point, okay, that this is very important to mention. When we talk about these problems, we cannot talk about these problems in supply shocks as if this is a today situation. There is a previous situation. And the previous situation is partly the responsibility of the external world and partly local responsibility. It's the responsibility of the external world in the sense that the continent never received full, proper advice and support from the international agency. Their voice is not heard, and there is a very serious need actually for a new economic system, in my opinion, where there is a complete change, not only including them in the World Bank or in the G20 as a member or something like that. We need a big change that represents the present division of power. But going back to Africa itself and building on the same point, the institutional structure within the African countries is weak. And because it is weak, the resilience of these economies to facing the supply shocks is actually very low. All right, so you find the need for institutional restructuring. You see government bodies that are not working with each other. You see central banks, and this is actually even stated by the IMF, that do not have trained staff and capabilities of analyzing the present situation and dealing with it. And of course, there are a lot of political disturbances within Africa. If you add and political instability, if you add all of these together, we are talking about a setting that does not make monetary policy work well. We are talking about a central bank that does not have a lot of independence. We are talking about one that does not have enough transparency. We are talking about limited trust in the entire economic system by the people. Okay? So even when they take a policy, you're not sure what's going to happen. Expectations, there is a very big question mark on expectations of inflation and expectations of what's to happen next. And then my final point is related to the exchange rate policy, which is often rigid in most of these countries. There isn't enough flexibility in the exchange rate. There is a lot of insistence on keeping a very strong national currency, even though this is hurting the economy and does not allow complete control of inflation. And even adopting a flexible exchange rate system is a problem in many of these countries because the dominant currency prices, shallow markets, foreign currency dominated liabilities, etc., etc., etc. So it's a bunch of local problems, okay, that are adding to the package. But it is essential that we repeat one key point, that the issue is not for Africa to face what's happening for outside. It has to start by fixing itself. And the monetary policy has to adopt a broader view of things. There's no one size that fits all. You cannot copy a policy of another country. And it has to be a comprehensive policy that accommodates the different vulnerabilities in the economy, the nature of the market, the nature of the people, and the social costs that are involved. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Ms. Abdellatif. I give now the floor to Mr. Badawi,
Mr. Badawi, what's your diagnostic on the current situation in Africa and on the monetary policy responses?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, and also let me take this opportunity to extend our appreciation not only on behalf of myself but also the network community of the Economic Research Forum for the opportunity to be here participating in this important symposium on African economies. Oops. So I will address the question.
Alors, il y a une présentation PowerPoint. So there's a PowerPoint presentation, I believe. Here it is.
Is it working? Okay, yes. So I think I want to go back. I think it is. Anyway, I think I can, no, this is my, this is not the fairest, this is the fairest one, understanding the context.
S'il vous plaît, est-ce que quelqu'un de l'assistance... Please, can someone from the technical staff help us? Who'd like to give this remote to someone who can actually control it and make it function? Bon, je propose... I suggest we start.
No. Understanding the context. Where is understanding the context? Anyway, let me say I start by suggesting that we need to understand the context of the current challenges, and essentially, okay. So essentially, I think what's important is to understand that African countries were characterized by high deficits and low growth problems that predates the COVID-19 pandemic and, of course, the subsequent war on Ukraine. Also, there were bad debt dynamics due to low economic growth. And then, of course, given these initial conditions, the weaknesses were exacerbated by the new shocks, the pandemic and especially the war on Ukraine. And even though this is based, whatever I'm saying is based on a study that was sponsored by the Economic Research Forum and the Finance for Development Lab, and a commission was set from 6 countries, whereby they actually basically found that high debt ratio left North Africa and MENA highly vulnerable to the series of shocks that rocked the world economy. If you look at the debt sustainability exercise, you will see that almost all the countries except for Morocco, which relatively has stronger balances, debt are not sustainable in 6 countries, including 4 countries from North Africa: Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, and Sudan, Sub-Saharan Africa. 3 from North Africa and 1 from Sub-Saharan Africa. You will also see that growth was very sluggish in the latter period, and that what generated the bad dynamics. The global supply chain disruptions that impacted, of course, the whole global economy constituted a direct impact on the prices of tradable. So tradable inflation was the immediate impact of the global supply disruptions. And this was further exacerbated by the high food import dependency of many African countries, as I will show in a minute. But then the seriousness and the challenge that the global supply disruption and the pressures associated with it, unlike, for example, the commodity shocks, the traditional commodity shocks, is that actually the global supply disruptions does not only directly influence the prices or cause inflationary tradables of tradable goods, but it also impacts a wide range of inputs, tradable inputs, that has consequences or second round consequences for the prices of non-tradable commodities in Africa, because many of the non-tradable services and products in Africa and in all of the developing countries depend on inputs, tradable inputs that were impacted by the supply chain disruptions. And so the danger is that it tends to anchor expectations of future higher inflation. And that was the reason why it is much more challenging than for central banks and monetary and economic authorities in general to deal with this kind of situation. As you can see here, this is the global supply chain disruption as reflected by the Global Supply Chain Index created by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And it is now increasingly being used in the research, including a very recent paper on Africa by some IMF staff. Extremely fascinating because they disaggregated the inflationary dynamics into several global and local components, and particularly accounting for the supply chain pressure, global supply chain pressure through this the change in this index. As you can see, especially after the outbreak of the pandemic and then after the war on Ukraine, this pressure index have increased considerably, which also, as you can see, both for the food price inflation in Africa, as well as the aggregate headline inflation, the contribution, which are these red bars of the global supply chain pressure, is quite significant. In fact, it accounted for most of the inflationary impulse in these countries. I will, for the interest of time, I will go straight to 3 cases in Africa, which is the evidence is part of a study that we did at the Economic Research Forum together with our sister organization or sister network in Nairobi, the African Economic Research Consortium. So this is a joint project on the impact of the supply chain pressure and the war on Ukraine in particular. And you can see that actually, for the case of Kenya, the combined import dependency of food from Ukraine and Russia accounts for more than 30% for Kenya. And you can see that the date of the month of February of the invasion of Ukraine triggered considerable, inflationary response in the global price of food, including also the dotted line, the prices of food in Kenya. And a similar story can be told about Mozambique and South Africa, where actually South Africa is a country which is not highly food dependent on imports because of the strengths of the South African agricultural sector. Mozambique, which is connected with the economy of South Africa through the Maputo corridor, is a very elaborate regional integration, regional cooperation, project. You can see that it's highly dependent on imports from Russia and Ukraine. And that's why you can see the prices impulse the inflation in that country. In terms of monetary policy responses, the monetary policy response is such that, because I cannot recover it. No, yeah, okay. Monetary policy response is that it presents as my colleague Dr. Abla said, it's a difficult gross tradable, inflation trade-off. And the reason why, because it actually affects an entire range of inputs. And so using high interest rate as an instrument against inflationary pressures is actually not sustainable. And the gross impact is quite high because it appreciates the exchange rate considerably. So the exchange rate become overvalued. Nonetheless, several African central banks face very low credibility. So if they allow actually the inflationary impulse to take its course, then actually expectations will be anchored in a negative way, that there will be an inflationary expectation of future inflation. And so many of these central banks, they will have to use the policy rate to jack up the policy rate. But the problem here, and this is something that we hope to discuss in the second round, is that this is a reactive response rather than an anticipatory response, because actually central bank should build capacity to monitor international trade, even international politics, and try to understand the potential for future supply chain, global supply chain pressures, global supply chain disruptions, and act anticipatory in an anticipatory way rather than being surprised. But then the issue of credibility is a big issue, because monetary policy is largely discretionary with very little knowledge about what to expect from central banks. And so this is another issue that requires some sort of, you will see actually here, that the West African Monetary Union and a few countries that really adopt heavily managed exchange rate regime, they were able to actually avoid major inflationary pressures, and which did not require them to increase the policy rate, the interest rate. But then other countries which try to adopt a more flex exchange rate regime, which is a good direction, of course, to pursue because of competitiveness, they could not contain inflation, of course. And so, so they have to use the policy instrument in this case. I think this is something that I will discuss in the context of the second phase about the role of fiscal policy, even though, of course, there is a whole session from the perspective of monetary policy, and then some ideas about the future direction of monetary policy and the role of central banks. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur El-Bedawi.
Thank you, Mr. Bedawi. I have a feeling that up to now, we had converging messages between the two of you when it comes to several aspects. Now we'll give the floor to Mr. Sélassié, who was far away, but Mr. Sélassié from the IMF, what is your perspective of the current challenges of monetary policy in Africa? And do you have any elements of convergence or divergence with what has been said up to now? Thank you.
fact that the cumulative nature of these shocks. So they've been layered one on top of the other. And then the third one, I think, is the fact that there has been a lot of uncertainty, unpredictability in terms of how the traditional relationship between monetary policy and the outcomes that you seek. There's been a lot of challenges in terms of figuring out how to do. I think this is the point particularly well laid out by Professor Abdellatif. So let me unpack these points, elaborate on these points a little bit. First, on the size of the shocks, I think what we've been struck by here at the IMF is the fact that any one of these 4 shocks that have hit the global economy since 2019 would have been considered, would have been difficult enough to contend with for many countries. But the fact that they've been layered upon each other, I think, complicates life. The 4 shocks I'm talking about, of course, here are first and foremost COVID, a once in a 100-year shock. I mean, that itself would have been enough to contend with. I think second is, of course, the supply chain disruptions that have been referred to. But I want to add one point here, if I may, which is that the policy response when COVID hit, I think we have to raise questions about whether or not there was a bit too much overstimulus, particularly in advanced countries. And I say this because we saw, even before Ukraine war and the spike in prices that we saw concurrently with that, even before that, we were seeing accelerating inflation. So in a context where supply chains had been disrupted, you had quite a lot of injection of fiscal and monetary policy stimulus. And I think, that explains a big chunk of the inflation that we saw, as much as what unfolded following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impact that had on fuel prices and food prices, etc. So I consider that also as the second shock. The third one, of course, is the events following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the fourth one is for at least countries in Africa, countries in many emerging markets and developing countries, the monetary policy tightening, which was so aggressive, so unexpected, that followed all of the unfolding events that I just discussed. So I think the fact that the size of each one of these shocks was major and that they were layered on top of each other is one of the things that strikes me as having complicated policy making, and made the surge in inflation, the effects that macroeconomic effects that we've seen unfolding in our region, so difficult. Second point I want to stress, as always, in a continent as diverse as Africa, of course, is the heterogeneity of outcomes. Even in this difficult environment, remarkably, there have been some countries that have kept inflation well contained. And I'm not here talking about just those countries which have fixed exchange rates, very hard pegs with the euro in particular, the zone franc countries, in WAEMU and CEMAC. But really, countries like Uganda are the ones that come to mind. Inflation at some points in the cycle was even lower than in many advanced countries. So there were quite a few countries that kept inflationary pressures at bay. And this is not just Uganda, but quite a few countries that kept inflation at around the 10% level. Again, for all of the reasons, the scale of the shock, the challenges many of our countries face that were elaborated on by Professor El-Badawi and Professor Abdellatif, it's remarkable that we even had countries with flexible exchange rate regimes, inflation targeting type regimes, that were able to contain inflation at bay. So I think that itself is something that we have to acknowledge, the heterogeneity of outcomes and circumstances. The third point, I think that has complicated monetary policy making, and again, not making particularly new point here that hasn't been touched on, is the fact that as in advanced countries, the relationship between central banks have not really known traditionally, there's already a lot of questions about the monetary transmission mechanism in our countries. We have shallow money markets, shallow FX markets. But on top of all of that, I think the relationship between, what we thought was the traditional relationship in terms of, length of the pass-through or when monetary policy can have effect, really has been long and variable and very, very uncertain this time. Largely because this is imported shock, and how you deal with that, of course, is always a complicated story if you're at the receiving end of inflationary shocks. Having said all of this, I'm always a little bit worried when the story about Africa, African countries tends to be always downbeat. And I want to flag two areas of resilience that we've seen. The first one, I think, is the fact that, even within the vast majority of countries, even as we've seen sovereign balance sheets being encumbered, I guess this is a topic we'll come to a little bit later, but even as we've seen, the public balance sheet under quite a bit of strain, and not quite staying there because, as governments have had to borrow domestically, in particular at higher cost, there's been some crowding out. Even acknowledging all of that, for the most part, we've seen private sector and household balance sheets remaining relatively robust. Again, the stress being relatively. Of course, consumption has been hit. Of course, livelihoods have been affected. But the fact that we don't have as much leverage in the corporate sector and household sector has also meant that the rise in interest rates, the dislocation that we've seen in many other countries hasn't been as widespread across the economy as it has been in many other cases where you have a lot more financial deepening. So I think that's one source of resilience that I wanted to flag in terms of how we want to think about the effects of monetary policy. And then lastly, I want to make one point, which is, one thing I really appreciated from the previous two interventions is really, how the recognition that the challenges that we face, there's no silver bullet, but also no unique cause for the difficulties that central banks have had in controlling inflation, in the macroeconomic imbalances that we've seen being exacerbated by the shock. I think, to a first approximation, why it's been difficult for African countries to deal with the economic fallout of these shocks, and particularly the pandemic, whereas we were able to do a lot better in terms of the health consequences of the pandemic, is a function of institutions being weak in a number of areas. I think financial markets, of course, remain shallow and limited. So countries have not been able, for example, to turn to domestic markets to defray, as an alternative to being shut out of external markets. The fact that they're shallow, limited in size, also has, of course, meant the cost of borrowing has been higher, and the crowding out effects that I mentioned earlier. State capacity or credibility, of course, has been weak. So whenever governments have had to borrow, I think it has been at the short term, again, at higher interest rates than would have been in other countries have been able to borrow. And then, of course, the important points that Professor Abdellatif raised also about there have been policy errors. I think this is a little bit overgeneralizing, but there have been, for sure, some countries where exchange rates have not been allowed to adjust and absorb shocks. That has complicated both monetary policy making by keeping inflation seemingly under control for a while, and then, of course, once defending the exchange rate became really difficult, and as central banks had to let go, we've had this surge in inflation also exacerbating conditions, creating uncertainty and undermining the monetary transmission mechanism, the credibility that had been gained over years in terms of how monetary policy would behave. So all of these factors, I think, have contributed to ensuring that the surge in inflation is as high as it has been, that the pass-through has been significant. But again, I think, all things considered, given how difficult the shocks have been, I see, also quite a bit of resilience. And I think, there is a path forward where our countries will almost certainly begin to recover and do much better in the coming years. Maybe this is something that we can turn to in the next session. Thank you.
This is something that we don't necessarily see in all the countries, including advanced countries. Secondly, we have low resilience sometimes because we have weak institutions. I'm sorry, I'm caricaturing a little bit. We have central banks that can be vectors of fragility because they're not always independent, they're not always deemed credible, and we have exchange rate regimes that are not always appropriate, and so it's not easy to work on them. And as Mr. Selassie was saying, there are sources of hope. Number one, the situation is not the same everywhere in Africa. And number two, the private sector seems to hold up quite well. There are reasons to believe that the private sector is not strongly impacted. Before giving the floor to the audience, I would like your reactions on two questions. I'll ask the first to Mrs. Ablan. We've understood that there are several difficulties in managing inflation in this context. We have the feeling that all central banks are increasing their rates. This is what we can see. Do we have reason to believe that this type of policy can harm the future or growth, the potential and growth outlook? I'm thinking of two things very quickly. For example, by discouraging investments that could be innovative, or by creating unemployment, which can harm the human capital of the populations. These are just two thoughts. So please give me your reactions and very quickly.
Already give part of the answer. Now, when you raise the interest rate, the obvious happens. All right, the interest rate is making the cost of borrowing high, therefore discouraging investment, and it's supposedly working on the demand side to increase savings. The situation right now in most central banks, I don't think they're measuring enough the elasticity, the response to the changes in the interest rate. It's not happening quick enough, so you're not quite sure if you are having the good effect and avoiding the bad effect. But for me, the long-term impact, this is the most dangerous. Because right now, I'm going to talk about Egypt. At this point, the interest rate in Egypt is over 20%. Now, an interest rate that's over 20%, how many activities in life can achieve a profit of 20% that comes without any troubles? Okay, you are better off closing your factory, not starting a business, putting your money in the bank, earning the interest, and that's it. Okay? And this is really the danger. Because this is a temporary situation, because the war and the entire situation is a temporary situation, but it's being faced by only one tool, and in so doing, you are discouraging new investments. And by the way, in the future, when things change, those investments, the same opportunity might not still exist. And when you think of entrepreneurship and innovation, which is driving the world, you are wasting the chances in the future for everybody. One last thing that I have to say, notice that all those supply shocks that we are talking about are man-made. So we're literally, as human beings, hitting ourselves in the foot big time, including the climate one, because it's all happening due to the emissions. And even the COVID, if you take the conspiracy theory into consideration, then there is something that's man-made that's involved. And at the end, we are suffering from the results. Thank you.
Merci. Je ne m'attendais pas à ce qu'on parle de conspiration.
Thank you. I didn't think we would be talking about conspiracy theory, but that's surprising and interesting. Mr. Badawi, given that the interest rates, we're saying that this is a risky policy. We're talking about the trade-off between the output gap, how to manage the output and inflation, this is the dilemma that we're faced with at some point in time. And we also see a temporal dilemma, managing the growth and output of tomorrow. Doesn't that lead us to think of another strategy? For example, a fiscal strategy that we combine with the less aggressive monetary policy? Up to you.
Yeah, I think obviously the issue could not be insulated from the fact that monetary policy in many African countries are dominated by fiscal policy. So there is fiscal dominance. And that is the main reason that, for example, what Dr. Abla mentioned, that actually the central banks were supposed to raise the interest rate exorbitantly in order to make up for the deficiency to generate resources through the budget. And I think the fairest order of business should be to reform fiscal policy in a very significant way in order to rationalize the structure of expenditure towards those items that are very critical for growth and also critical for social protection. And at the same time, free monetary policy in order to pursue policies that promote growth. And policies that promote growth requires moderate interest rate, as well as, of course, competitive exchange rate. And this cannot happen without extricating monetary policy from fiscal dominance. I would like to say something about the future, but I think this is a second question, right? Or do you want me to go ahead and? Okay. I think, I just wanted to say a few things about, first of all, I already mentioned the importance of building capacity in central banks about, global trade and supply chain issues in order to be able to be responsive in an anticipatory way. But it's also important to think in a more deeper way about graduating from discretionary monetary policy to rule-based monetary policy, as well as rule-based macroeconomic policy. And here I want to stress the twinship between fiscal rules and monetary regimes that are also transparent and open and based on rules. And I think there are few countries that could be cited as example where fiscal rules and monetary rules have been going hand in hand, and they actually paid a lot of dividends to those countries that adopted this. The exchange rate regimes following certain rules, such as inflation targeting, as well as flex regimes that target, for example, in the case of energy or commodity exporting countries, a basket of commodities along the lines of what Jeff Frankel have suggested for the Kuwait, for the GCC countries, and then later on expanded it to include minerals and some key commodities in a basket that actually account for major currencies, but also for an index of prices of the major export commodities, so that you could have an automatic or almost automatic stabilizing effect and responding to the changes in terms of trade. And all of this requires very competent central banks in terms of capabilities, and also in terms of measure of institutional dependence, in order to be able to adopt these policies and to work hand in hand with the Ministry of Finance that is bound by fiscal rules, and these fiscal rules force the fiscal authorities to adopt the kind of rules that were accepted. And again, all of these are part and parcel of a social contract, and a communication strategy for the society in order to understand and accept the very difficult decision that would be required. Thank you.
Merci pour votre réponse.
Thank you very much for your answer. Now, the watchword here is the rules and not discretions. The watchword, therefore, is the rules and not discretion. Any questions in the room? We can opt for a Q&A session. I will here gather a certain number of questions. If time allows, I will answer there too. Yes. Yeah, I'll give the floor later. Yeah, I see a question is there. We will cater for a first question. Thank you. Please, as short as possible. In French or in English, it's up to you, sir. Nabil Nashet, OCP Group.
Energy transition and the need for critical minerals and energy. Since energy is the cost of energy is more higher than before, isn't an opportunity for the African countries to export these commodities? We know that Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cote d'Ivoire as a new country who exports oil, for example. I think inflation, my question isn't inflation, we have to accept it since we don't have big room to act in fiscal or monetary policies, and instead of that, we have to work more on these transition, energy transition as an opportunity and business economic policies that are investment friendly. Thank you.
Merci. Deuxième question. Oui, monsieur.
Second question, please. Thank you. Your microphone, sir. Yeah, thank you.
Everybody has mentioned the importance of the four shocks that have been discussed. And I wanted to point out that for me, one of the major implications of these four shocks is that they have been used by authorities and policymakers everywhere to kind of cover up on their past failures. So we have countries have tended to blame the shocks on the problems that they have faced then and now. And while the big problems is the failures of the policies before the COVID-19 itself, and even after COVID-19. So, which seems to me that sometimes we are trying to assess the policies and the impact as a response to the shocks, while in fact, the problem is the response to the previous failures, whether we have been facing them or not. And this leads me to a question to Abla on Egypt. And this applies to Egypt, I think you know very well what I mean, because the inflation in Egypt is not due to the four shocks. It's due to the failures of the Egyptian policy mix before the COVID-19. And so you complain about 20% of interest rate, policy rate. And this is not due to the shocks. This is not it's due to the failures of the macro framework before that. So you complain about 20%, so what do you propose? I mean, how do you solve the problem of the excess borrowing of the government over the last, many, many years, which have led to this high inflation and have led to the debt problems of Egypt, and you don't like the 20%, so what do you propose?
Okay, merci.
Thank you. Thank you. I think Mrs. Abla has really understood the question, that the question was addressed to her. Let me cater for a third question now. Yes, third, maybe last question in passing. Madam? Yes, good afternoon. My question relates to the foreign exchange regimes. I wanted to know, within this inflationist contract which has struck and impacted on Africa, has there been any thought or reflection on the role of the foreign exchange schemes or regimes? Do a mapping or a distinction or a benchmarking, comparative benchmarking, to know what type of forex regime and what country belonging to this or the other regime that have borne the brunt of this inflation surge in Africa. I refer in South Sahel to Egypt, that has gone through record inflation because of the flexibilization as at the end of 2018. Thank you. Thank you for these three questions. Let me recall the first question there. Is it not the occasion to do an energy transition? It is still the topic of Egypt here. Are the shocks that we have to blame on, or are we to blame our institutions? And the third one on the foreign exchange regimes, and have we learned anything on that? Mr. Selassie, you are free to also react on a question that you may see to your interest. Can you hear us? Oui, je peux.
Please choose any question you prefer.
A couple of reactions, if I may. I think, you know, the question of particularly on what's to blame for the severe macroeconomic imbalances that some of our countries are facing right now. Is it policies pre-pandemic or the shocks? And I think this is really, as always, a bit of a difficult question. Huh? I think, of course, nobody would have expected the pandemic to break out the way it did, or indeed kind of the other shocks that were to come. I think so. I think we have to give some allowance to policymakers that, you know, to the extent that they were projecting, you know, growth going forward would be whatever was in the baseline forecast. I think that's not an unreasonable thing to have expected that would be sustained, and also fiscal policy would behave in that manner. Now, again, I think around this central theme, there's a lot of variations. Some countries were, you know, speeding quite fast, as it were, like on the motorway. So an accident perhaps was more likely to happen in those countries, that, you know, but others were not unreasonable in the expectations that they had. So I think it depends on depends on particular country circumstances. And here I want to really underscore the point that was made by Professor El-Badawi on the importance of, or the difficulty that, you know, policymakers, fiscal policymakers in particular, face. Something I've called fiscal trilemma. I think if you're a minister of finance, and of course you would know a lot more in a country, I mean, you know, everybody's on your case to spend more on development areas, you know, given the huge development needs our countries have, infrastructure, health, education, the pressure is just relentless. So that's one leg of the trilemma. The other, of course, is, you know, when you try and raise taxes as a minister of finance to pay for this, you know, it's a huge challenge to raise the revenues that are needed. Nobody wants to pay taxes. So that's the second leg of the trilemma. And the third, of course, is that, you know, the alternative to using taxes to pay for the spending initiatives you have is, of course, borrowing, and that's, you know, easier said than done. In many cases, borrowing spaces is just not there, and if you try and exploit any scope for debt tolerance that there may be, the cost is higher, and you end up, you know, as some countries did, tipping into an unsustainable position when a shock hits. So really, really difficult balancing acts that our governments have, and the answer to that is, over time, needing to strengthen the social contract, make the case for collecting more taxes, spending wisely the money, showing that, you know, the taxes that are being raised are being used efficiently. So I think, you know, some sympathy also for policymakers is in order. And then I also want to just say on the question about what an appropriate exchange rate regime might be. for our countries. You know, I've had the privilege of working in countries with flexible regimes, with fixed exchange rate regimes around the world. And the one thing that often gives rise to crisis, almost always, in fact, is the fact that policymakers do not stick to what they are saying that they're doing. So if you're fixing your exchange rate regime, if you want to have a fixed exchange rate, then you have to import monetary policy behavior of the exchange rate that you're pegging yourself to. It's often when you try to fix the exchange rate and then try and have higher monetary growth, lower interest rates than the country that you're pegging your currency to, that problems arise. In a similar vein, with flexible exchange rate regimes, when you say you have a flexible regime and then try and lean against flexibility, and you have to end up using often your reserves, that's exactly also when trouble comes up. So consistency in doing what you're saying that you're doing in your regime, predictability in that regime, of course, coupled with the issues that were raised earlier about coordination with fiscal policy, are often the root cause of the challenges that we see in the exchange rate regime sphere. Thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Merci pour votre réponse.
Thank you for your answer. Mrs. Abla, over to you, please.
The third question has already been addressed. Let me work on the first two. The one talking about the critical minerals and their importance. We didn't hear a lot about critical minerals before. Okay, suddenly everybody is talking about it. In T20, they were talking about it. They dedicated the whole session to talk about it as being very important and a precondition for the transition. And as you produce an electric car, you need an incredible amount of minerals. And the reason it was talked about this way is because China stopped exporting to the US the minerals. Okay, so the reason it came to the surface again is because the superpowers are playing with each other and we are all paying the price. All right? I'm saying this because when you say that we need to focus on these areas, it's important that we try to capture our opportunities, but we need to remember that context. One, two, this cannot replace adopting the right monetary policies and fiscal policies, because this is something else, and they all work together. So this is as far as the first question is concerned. As far as the second comment is concerned, and it had to come from Dr. Nabli, of course, who else would read this question, okay? What do I need? What do you want? Okay, I want a complete institutional reform in Egypt. Egypt needs that. The issue is not the monetary policy or the fiscal policy. The issue is changing the management of the entire economic system institutionally. And by institution, we are talking about having a smaller number of ministries, by having proper governance, by not having the minister in charge of execution also being the head of the regulatory body. Okay? These are all institutional issues. Choosing the right people in the right places, adopting the correct concepts of things. If this is done, okay, then things are going to improve. The 20% maybe would not be a terrible problem if the business environment within which people operate were functioning correctly. If young people who start entrepreneurship would be able to step out of their business if the bankruptcy laws are easy, instead of being stuck with taxes until for generations to come, etc., etc., etc. So it's fixing the entire system that will take care of things and will revive the productive machine and take Egypt where it belongs, because Egypt is a very rich country at every level and deserves to be in a completely different place if we are managing our resources properly. And of course, I agree completely with the concept that it's not if the shocks are responsible for no more than 20% of what we are facing. 80% of what we are facing are because of the existing system that needs serious change. Thank you.
Merci. J'ai l'impression qu'en partant d'une question...
I'm under the impression that we started from a secular question. We have really come quickly on institutional structure and long-term flaws or defects that are not really the reason or the corollary of the current context. Mr. Badawi, do you want to add anything else, or do you want us to care for other questions? Maybe other questions. Any other questions that you wish to ask that we may find be an answer to? It's a passion-packed topic, so by show of hands, certainly we'll have to see many people wishing to take the floor. Any other question from the floor, please? There be none? Yeah, maybe Mr. Jaidi. Yeah, sorry. There was Madam first. Yeah. Let's respect the logic and not the etiquette.
Elaborate a little more on what you were saying earlier about adopting some new policy instruments. Does that mean having central banks expand their mandates? What does that mean? Yes, more comprehensive tools. You were talking about that earlier. I don't know if you had something in mind that you would like to elaborate on. Thank you.
Monsieur Bedawi.
Mr. Bedawi.
With the interest rate, they can change the level of reserves that banks are adopting. Okay, people are focused on the interest rate. They are looking at it. It's giving them a signal on, in the case of Egypt, on where the dollar is going to go. So every time the interest rate goes up, people say, "Aha, the dollar is going to go even up, even higher." So their expectations of inflation are even higher, and it's going to be reflected in the prices of things. So you are getting into a cycle of higher and higher inflation because of things like that. So this is another tool. Of course, all the maneuvering with the foreign reserves and the interactions that the central bank can do, they can do it without necessarily touching the interest rate. This is brief. I hope I answered your question.
Merci. On revient à Monsieur Jaidi.
Let's come back to Mr. Jaidi, who wanted to raise or ask a question. Let me come back to the question that was referred to by the different speakers on the very fact that facing such nature shock decisions, the monetary policy will always have a role to play, but we have to revisit it according to the new and in the light of new data. But one of the aspects that is being posed to the regulation today of the economic policy, not only in the African country, but most particularly in the African countries, is the quest for this balance between monetary and fiscal policy. It is being put forth often as being the most adequate answer today to the shocks that cannot be solely demand-driven or supply-driven, but which make it possible to also ponder, as we will see later the next session, to ponder on how the fiscal policy can adapt to this new datum. How do you see this conversion? How do you see this mixed policy mix? Let's put aside the question of coordination between the stakeholders of this policy, and I'm talking from an instrumentalization. What avenues would we have to act on the fiscal and monetary policy to see to it that the convergence of these two policies would give rise at least to a certain number of conditions that are favorable to a rallying of the economic activities and to a regrowth, and at the same time by aiming also the long term and the willingness to restructure these economies?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. Anyone wishing to take the floor? Mr. Badawi or Mr. Selassie, maybe?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, yes, I think this is an important question facing not only policymakers, but also facing, the society at large in the country, because it's not only the supply chain disruptions and the shocks, but the way the global economy is moving towards digitalization and automation and artificial intelligence. I think many respected development thinkers and economists are suggesting that actually the future is likely to be much more challenging for Africa and for the emerging market economies in general, and that the manufacturing sector is no longer going to provide, according to even early data from firm levels, is going to become the sector that will provide large-scale job opportunities. It will continue to be a growth escalator. And so, tradable services and agriculture will have to be modernized significantly. But still, there will be a challenge of providing social protection to a larger number of job seekers, especially young people, who may not have the opportunity to benefit from the opportunities of the digitech. So I think prioritizing growth and generating value and revenue in order to pay for the social protection will put huge onus on what you said in terms of designing some sort of a policy mix, fiscal and monetary, that would actually promote growth, generate sufficient resources domestically, and provide for social protection. I think that would be my take on this.
Oui, Madame Ablin.
I just want to add something. If we are talking very practically on the ground, those two institutions need to see each other, not behave like they are coming from different countries, because this is typically the case. Okay? They are not sharing data more often than not. So the central bank is not sharing the full data to the fiscal authorities as if it's the enemy. Okay? And so you end up with contradiction that need not take place. For example, suppose that the central bank adopts a low interest rate in order to encourage exporters. For instance, you cannot have the Ministry of Finance the very next day impose a new tax on the exporters. So this type of consistency, seeing each other in order to navigate through the difficult situation that we are in. One of the main reasons why most of the African countries are in trouble is because they do not work together. They work as separate silos. This kind of integration of activities is the one that's going to take us forward. Of course, in addition to what Dr. Badawi said about the future.
Merci. Monsieur
Thank you. Mr. Selassie, do you want to add something?
Quickly, in terms of just policy formulation within countries, I see. I think perhaps three. I don't want to say litmus tests, but maybe three principles that should animate us. I think the first one is making sure that the policies that we are going after are country specific. I'm teeing off a little bit here from what Professor El-Badawi said. I see right now, for example, quite a number of country authorities in sub-Saharan Africa raising the issue of, what should countries be doing? Should we revisit industrial policy in light of the need to do green transition, etc.? And my answer always is this really the most pressing challenge that your country faces, Minister, at this moment? So I think making sure that we're not distracted and going after the latest shiny object and thinking about what it is that our countries need at a given time. And this is, I think, true for macro policy setting as much as anything else is important. I remember a few years ago when the sense that you could have unconstrained monetary growth and it will not result in modern monetary theory, as it was called, was all the rage, and a number of ministers raising it. And then it was a little bit, digital currency. So I think just thinking about the context of a country and not being carried by the latest fad is important. Second, I think, is, of course, even within a country, context specificity, because over time, the priorities can change. Right now, For example, I think this issue of the coordination of monetary and fiscal policy is really, really important, really important. One of the key things that needs to be addressed in order to continue to reduce macroeconomic imbalances, get interest rates lower, for all the reasons that, that were discussed earlier. Then thirdly, honestly, is, just pragmatism and humility. I think given that we are in such an uncertain, at a point of maximum uncertainty about how things are going to be evolving as a result of, things like climate change, but also, these shocks and how they are playing out. I think it wasn't so long ago that we were expecting oil prices to be declining. Now they're back up. A lot of things like that happening. So I think in the calibration of monetary and fiscal policy, but other policies, some pragmatism and being nimble to fine-tune policies is also another principle that should animate economic policy formulation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Alors, très peu.
We have very little time, less than 2 minutes. I think we have a last question, very briefly, please. Mr. Tazi Kamal from the M6 University in Rabat. You're right about when you mention that the inflation we're facing today is due to external shocks. And those external shocks stem from the interdependence of the global economy. Today, central banks are very limited in their means, and it's very difficult to predict what will happen when interest rates will be raised, given the positive and negative effects on the various economic variables, the financial markets, monetary mass, etc. It's very difficult to predict, and very often the central banks should act. And in order not to face criticism, they resort to interest rate hikes. I will start with interdependence. Today we fight inflation much more than before, but we're facing geopolitical problems. The interpreter apologizes, but the quality of the sound is very poor. Geopolitics today interferes in the economy. And we're facing many more geopolitical issues than economic ones. So there's no coordinated action and no global governance at play, and domestic monetary policies are needed, but their effects are limited. There is very little time to hear the answers. You can answer, but very briefly, please.
That there are geopolitics involved, and they are controlling a lot of things, and I agree with, we cannot disagree with that, but what is for sure and is being emphasized by everybody is that what's happening externally is responsible for only part of the problem. The rest of the problem is local. If these economies were more resilient, they would have been able to face the problems way better. If international organizations did their duty, then we would not have been all stuck in debt the way we are. If developed countries did not have the emissions that they are having, Africa would not have been in trouble. If we are not imposing rules on Africa to stop, to go for a green transition that will never achieve manufacturing under the present circumstances, this would not have been the case if our voice were louder. We need a louder South voice.
Bon, pas de chance, Monsieur El Badawi veut dire quelque chose.
Mr. El Badawi wanted to mention something.
As part of our studies that we did with the Economic Research Forum, with the African Economic Research Consortium, we paired countries like Senegal and Morocco, Egypt and Sudan, Ethiopia and Kenya, and the most fascinating one is South Africa and Mozambique, and how the Maputo Corridor, which is a regional integration project between the two countries, infrastructure and everything, have significantly insulated Mozambique from the global supply shocks because of the supply of agricultural products to Mozambique from South Africa. So maybe that's the way to go for Africa.
Merci, merci à tous les intervenants.
Thank you to all the contributors. We are now, we reach now the end of this session. Thank you for attending. And we will now address the challenges of fiscal policy following on from this session's topic. Thank you again.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now take a 15 minutes coffee break in the